For all we have and are, for all our children's fate, stand up and take the war. The Hun is at the gate. Our world has passed away, in wantoness overthrown. There is nothing left today but steel and fire and stone. Though all we knew depart, the old commandments stand. In courage, keep your heart. In faith, lift up your hand. Once more we hear the word that sickened earth of old. No law except the sword, unsheathed and uncontrolled. Once more it knits mankind. Once more the nations go to meet and break and bind a crazed and driven foe. Comfort, content, delight, the ages slow-bought gain. They shriveled in a night, only ourselves remain, to face the naked days in silent fortitude, through perils and dismays, renewed and re-renewed. Though all we knew depart, the old commandments stand. In courage keep your heart, in strength lift up your hand. No easy hope or lies shall bring us to our goal, but iron sacrifice of body, will, and soul. There is but one task for all, one life for each to give. What stands if freedom fall? Who dies if England live? That is the poem For All We Have and Are by Joseph Rudyard Kipling. Rudyard Kipling was born on the 30th of December 1865 in Bombay, India, to his parents Alice and John Kipling. In 1865, the British Empire was halfway through its expansion throughout the 18th, 19th and 20th century. And the British Raj, where Kipling grew up for the first 5 years of his life, was kind of the epicenter of colonialism and the epicenter of British jingoism, and kind of, it was on the fringe of the empire, the outer realms, the outer dominions. And so this contextual imperialism really influenced Kipling from that really young age of 5 years, and it can be seen throughout the rest of the writing for his life. In fact, as the jingoistic expansion of the British Empire continues to cover about a quarter of the world's landmass, there's a positive relationship between the imperialistic might of the British Empire and the imperialistic, jingoistic, patriotic writings of Kipling through his short stories and poems, as seen through For All We Have and Are. And so after living in Bombay for 5 years, Kipling was sent back to Britain, or Kipling was sent to Britain, I suppose, to start his education. He went to a public school in Devon, and instead of going to Oxford, he then returned to India, where he spent 1883 to 1889 back in India. And there he worked for a magazine, and in this magazine was where he started to write his poetry and short stories and became a bit locally famous. And he wrote and wrote and wrote and had quite a large output of stories. And then in 1889 he'd saved up enough and he decided that he was going to move back to London. And he moved to London and he established a base there, and he then became quite famous, quite well known. He became the prophet of imperialism as Britain expanded further and further into the world and gained more and more territory. And Kipling further enforced this through his poetry and prose and short stories. He then met a woman who he married. She was American, so they moved to America for several years, where he met Mark Twain. They got on quite well. Then he came back to America with his daughter, Josephine, who he'd had over America with his wife. And then he established himself in 1902 in Batesman House, which is a large country house in rural England. He was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1907, being the first Englishman to do so. And then 7 years later, the First World War broke out. And within a month, Kipling had written For All We Have and Are, the patriotic, rabble-rousing call to arms of a poem that it is. And we can see in the first 4 lines of the first stanza, stand up and take the war, the Hun is at the gate. Here, Kipling really sets the mood of the whole poem, that at its pragmatic level, it's a practical call to the men of England to rise up and join the army and fight the Hun, this barbaric German Hun, which really formed the basis of Kipling's poetry at the beginning of World War One was his hatred of the Germans and everything German. In fact, Kipling was once even quoted for saying, "However the world pretends to divide itself, there are only two divisions in the world today: human beings and the Germans." That is quite a quote. That really is for any poet. Kipling didn't even see the Germans as people. He simply saw them as barbaric things. It was quite extreme. And with this in mind, one can then begin to understand the full overarching theme and mood of For All We Have and Are. And so he continues in the first stanza, "In Wantona's overthrown, there is nothing left today." And in these two lines, Kipling is actually making a comment on England and its unprepared nature to fight a war with such large armies. The British Army in 1914 had been very small and elite just to police the British Empire, and really didn't have the numbers to face up to the continental armies of, say, Germany. And then this concept of not being ready and a bit lazy is further enforced in the third stanza, where "comfort, content, delight, the ages show game." So, Britain has built up this kind of lazy, relaxed mood, but really when we have to get down to it, we have to fight with a proper big army, is what Kipling was saying here. Back to the first stanza, he then comes off with, "Though all we knew depart, the old commandments stand. In courage keep your heart, in strength lift up your hand." And this is really where the large conceptual idea of this righteousness, this moral right, this crusade against Germany, this idea of good versus evil. It's not just the Hun at the gate. It's the Germans at the gate of humanity. It's the Germans at the gate of civilization. And England and the Allies are the only people who can defend this gate against this barbaric Hun. This can be seen further in the second stanza, where he goes, "Once more it knits mankind, once more the nations go, to meet and break and bind a crazed and driven foe." I mean, the choice of words there is just incredible, really. Once more it knits mankind. So he divides mankind from the foe being the Germans, and mankind, of course, being everyone else. And that shows, linking in with the quote, that, humans aren't Germans. It's quite incredible, really. And to meet and break and bind. You meet the enemy, you obliterate it, and you bind it into the earth, never to be seen again. That is just complete, utter destruction. It really is quite something. And then in the final fourth stanza, he just ties it all up with, "What stands if freedom fall? Who dies if England live? If freedom fall, Germany will rise." And Kipling can't have that, because that threat to freedom, that threat to humanity, that threat to civilization has to be stopped. And so Kipling created this jingoistic poem, For All We Have and Are. And it really is an example of his patriotic, jingoistic love of England and war and hate of the Germans. And then all of this changed in September 1915, when his only son, John Kipling, was hit in the head by shrapnel. His body was never found, and in Kipling's lifetime, and was only identified in the late 90s. The effect on Kipling was, to say the least, dramatic. I have a quote here from Dylan J. Sirois, who works at the University of Maine. "The death of his son shook Kipling's support for Britain and its policies. Although he did not become an anti-imperialist, he definitely gave up on his role as the prophet of imperialism. Kipling no longer held unwavering trust in the leaders of the country. Although he was a patriotic Englishman till his death, he saw the folly of his ways. Who knows how many more men joined the war on account of Kipling and his work?" And the last sentence there is in specific reference to that Kipling tried and tried and tried again, and encouraged his son to join the British Army, to join the Navy. He was refused for the Navy originally, and then Kipling had to pull some strings to get his son into the army due to poor eyesight. And so Kipling felt a personal sorrow, a personal grief, a personal deep guilt about how his jingoistic nature really led to the death of his son, and his jingoistic poems, well, how much more death have they led to? And so this change can be seen in the poem Gethsemane. "The garden called Gethsemane, in Picardy it was, and there the people come to see the English soldiers pass. We used to pass, or halt as it might be, and ship our masks in case of gas beyond Gethsemane. The garden called Gethsemane, it held a pretty lass, but all the time she talked of me, I prayed my cup might pass. The officer sat in his chair, the men lay on the grass, and all the time we halted there, I prayed my cup might pass. It didn't pass, it didn't pass. It didn't pass from me. I drank it when we met the gas beyond Gethsemane. And that poem, personally to me, is one of the most haunting pieces of poetry from the Great War. The idea of I drank it when we met the gas beyond Gethsemane. I drank the poison. And obviously this is, again, in a religious context or in a religious comparison, like with the commandments. Kipling is now comparing this soldier in Picardy to Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. And so, of course, the cup of poison can be seen from Matthew chapter 26, verse 39. O my Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as thou wilt. And here Jesus is saying to God, I really do not want to sacrifice myself for these people, but I will if you want me to. And then here, some people read it as this, and I do as well. Kipling does something, in my view, quite incredible. Kipling continues with his soldier, and instead of his soldier being like Jesus and saying, I will happily sacrifice myself for the cause, I will sacrifice myself, I will die for my king and country, if you want me to. I don't want to, but if you want me to, I will. However, this soldier in the poem prays to be spared no matter what. He has no acceptance of his duty. Even if God wills it, there's no embrace of this sacrifice that the soldier must give. And so the soldier's anguish is wholly human. There's no heroic sacrifice. This is just the death of another soldier, which is quite catastrophic, which is incredibly stark when compared to For All We Have and Are. When Kipling puts forward this idea of good versus evil, of the mighty versus the damned, and here Kipling writes of this soldier who rejects God's will and rejects it again and prays and prays and prays and then dies because he has to. The contrast is cataclysmic. It really is. And so within the Garden of Gethsemane, it's in the syllables are in a 6/8 scheme with 6/8 syllables, 8 syllables, and this is a very traditional rhyming scheme of English folk tunes and English poetry. It's very traditional of the common people, and so kind of be thought that Kipling is trying to write this in the view of a commoner, of the common prose, because of the idea of the common soldier is just giving an honest kind of view on his death, as he is seen as the soldier, in Gethsemane, about to march off and die in the gas. And so it is really a commonist pattern, this 6/8 syllable difference here. And then with the reference of the lass in the second stanza, Kipling actually made a comment on that himself. What makes war more poignant is the presence of women, with whom one can talk and make love only an hour or so behind the line. And so with the reference to the lass, it shows that even though it seems like human nature and human normality is so close, just an hour behind the front line, I will never be able to escape my duty. I will never be able to escape this death. And so the difference between Kipling's jingoistic, patriotic poetry before the death of his son and after. The difference is so stark, it's really mind-blowing. And he was a different man from that point onwards. He was a changed man. He was still patriotic, but it was realistic patriotism. Realistic. And so I think from this experience of these two poems and Rudyard Kipling, we can really learn something about the world. That we can learn that to not follow governments in blind faith, and to not follow jingoism and patriotism in blind faith, but to really have a realistic view of the world and war, and to think about things properly before considering or convincing people to go off and do things. And that's why Kipling should be studied, with the difference between the poems written before the death of his son and after.